Okay, I think we can start our discussion today. Hear me? We finish on what we were discussing last week. We mentioned consumption, savings, and investment. So we need to continue assessing that topic and see whether we can finish what we were discussing last week. Now, maybe to remind you on what we were discussing, so we discussed about the consumption function last week, and we said that the consumption function is simply an increasing function of the disposable income. So we have a consumption function here. It's made up of two parts, and I explained ends. So the first part, which is far, I said it represents autonomous consumption. That is consumption when your income is zero. It does not depend on the level of income. Then the other part, which is beta y, is the assumption that it depends on your income. I said that as income increases, your consumption also increases. So the second part, that's what it represents. And the beta is what we refer to as the marginal propensity to consume. So which simply shows the increase in consumption as a result of an increase in income. Or in other words, you can say this is the change in arising from a unit change in income. That is what we call alpha. And that consumption that depends on the income. I mentioned about the autonomous consumption and the one that depends on income. Now the autonomous consumption is simply consumption when income is zero. So consumption can also depend on other sources of money apart from the income that you earn from proper employment. It can depend from savings and transfer payments. So the can be represented by that diagram. So the first part, which is autonomous consumption, is represented by A, and it does not depend on the income. Then the other part, which is upward sloping, simply depends on the income. So you also have a propensity to consume. So the average propensity to consume is the proportion of disposable income that is spent on consumption by consumption divided by the income. So in consumption function, we have and divide the entire function by income. So hence the income. So if you divide the entire function by, then that gives you the average propensity to consume, so which is represented by that equation. Then the marginal propensity to consume, which is in consumption over the change in income. So it will different function is represented by the mentioned something about savings, and I said that this amount of things at each level of disposable personal income. Savings is simply the difference between your income and the consumption. So what you don't consume is saved. And in simple terms, we can represent our savings function as the difference between income and consumption. So this gives you savings function. So if from our consumption function, derive the savings function. So we can derive the consumption function. Now the previous slide, this is the previous slide you are asking. So the other propensity to consume, that's what I mentioned, which is the proportion of disposable income that is spent on consumption. So if we have our consumption function as alpha plus beta y, so you can divide everything by y. And I said y is the income. So if you divide everything by y, this part here. So this is the average propensity to consume. Then the same function I've said is simply the difference between your income and the consumption. Now, if we have the consumption function given by this, simply generate the savings function. So the savings function is simply income minus consumption. That is y minus alpha minus beta y, this part here. Then the will be given by negative alpha plus y minus beta y. Then you can substitute or factor out y. So what you get is simply the savings function. So you can see the savings function is also a function of income. So diagrammatically, the savings function is represented as, now this part here, 0. When your income is 0, your savings is negative. What does that imply? You are simply borrowing to consume, and then therefore your savings is negative. So when your savings rises above 0, then there is some level of savings that is done. That's why the savings function then starts to slope upwards when your income is above 0. This is what sloping, which simply implies that savings is an increasing function of income. That your savings. Now the slope of the savings function is the marginal propensity to save. So the marginal propensity to from this diagram is simply this part here. This part here gives marginal propensity to save, which is simply 1 minus beta. So 1 minus beta is what we call or we refer to as the marginal propensity to save, which is simply the slope of the savings function. Now, the propensity to save is simply the change in savings resulting from a unit change in the personal disposable income. So you have the average propensity to save, which is simply the proportion of income, which is simply savings by propensity to save. This simply means if income increases, then your saving average propensity to save reduces, and vice versa. So there is an important relationship that you need to note between the MPC and MPS. That is no propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. So the marginal propensity to save and the marginal propensity to consume adds up one. Or in simple terms, the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. This is an important relationship that you need to understand. So if I take you back a little bit, so check the marginal propensity to save. So we said earlier that beta is what? Marginal propensity to consume. And the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus beta. Look at that. It confirms that relationship that the marginal propensity to consume, or the marginal propensity to save plus the marginal propensity to consume should be equal to 1. Now, let's continue with consumption first. We need to look at income as a major determinant of consumption. So the Keynesian consumption theory suggests that consumption is linearly dependent on income. So that in the short run, we have which is made up of consumption and the part that depends on the income. Now, in the Keynesian theory, savings is a function of income, while investment is a function of the interest rate. Now, in the long run, it is assumed that consumption entirely depends on income. Because as the income increases or as income becomes very large, the autonomous consumption simply disappears. Then we'll have consumption of income. Now this is the consumption function. So the consumption function said is function of what? Income. So horizontal axis, then consumption the vertical axis. So that slope or that diagram is simply upward sloping. So the consumption function is upward sloping. It starts from the origin. So implying that consumption purely depends on the level of income. That is in the long run. But in the short run, we said we have autonomous consumption and have that part that depends on the level of income. So in the classical economics, savings is a function of the interest rate. Now, you need to understand the relationship between savings and the interest rate. Now, your savings will depend on the interest that you earn from your savings. So if the interest rate that you can earn, or interest you earn from your savings is higher, then you will be required to do what? To sacrifice your save. So which means that if the commercial banks and the other institutions offer a high rate of interest, then you will sacrifice some in order to save more. And that is whatever you consume will be seen between the difference between your income and the savings. That means that your savings will be a function of interest. Savings in this case will be an increasing function of the interest rate, which implies that as the interest rate increases, then the savings will also increase. So in this case, consumption decreasing function of the interest rates. So if the interest rates goes up, then consumption reduces. Now the simple reason is because the consumers will sacrifice some some consumption in order to increase their savings. Now, the classical theory emphasizes consumption as a function of interest rates. We also have the Keynesian economics, which emphasizes income as the main determinant of consumption. Now, we can make or draw the following inferences from that statement: that consumption is a staple function of income. That implies that if consumption increases, then the likelihood of consumption increasing is high. So it is mostly determined by consumption and the income. So the consumption increases as the income increases, but not as much as the increase in income. So you need to look at the beta that we discussed. So beta is less than 1, which implies that consumption increases less proportionately to an increase in income. That is what it means. Now, in the long run, a greater proportion of income will be saved as real income increases, and therefore the average propensity falls with an increase in income. So income is a major determinant of consumption. The discussion on consumption, let's look at the theories of consumption. There is a number of theories that have been put forward to explain the consumption behavior by households. The first thing analyze is what we as the absolute income hypothesis. So the aggregate hypothesis was formulated by Keynes. Now, according to this hypothesis, consumption is a function of the current level of disposable income. Now, that simply means that consumption is determined by our current level of personal disposable. So the personal disposable income is simply what is left after you have paid taxes. So once you have paid taxes, whatever is available for your consumption is referred to as the personal disposable. So Keynes, consumption is a function of disposable person. The consumption is directly but proportionately related to the current level of aggregate disposable income, both in the short run and in the long run. So that simply means that the average propensity to consume decreases come in. Now, this assumption is simply based on the argument that consumers' reaction to income change is not instant. Gradual as the change in income. Now, the consumers simply react to the income change with the time. When you get, for example, a short-term income, your increase in consumption. So that is why the absolute income hypothesis simply says that the consumption is a function of the level of personal disposable income. Now, since the short-term increase in income may not have a major effect on consumption decisions, so you may not increase your consumption based on the short-term increase in your income, since that increase is not permanent. Now, to be specific, consumption is made up of the following. So the consumption over time is made up of the following. So we have the first part, which is the consumption. We have the second part, which is the consumption that depends on your level of income. And then the last part is consumption. That is the previous level of consumption also influences current level of consumption. C T minus 1 simply refers to the previous level of consumption. Now, according to the absolute income hypothesis, your current level of consumption depends on the autonomous consumption plus the consumption that depends on the income and the previous level of consumption. The second theory that or income hypothesis. Second theory of consumption is what we refer to as the relative income hypothesis. That is the second theory of consumption. So what does the relative income hypothesis says? Now the relative income hypothesis simply makes some two key assumptions: that consumption behavior of the individual is interdependent, that the consumption relationships are irreversible over time. So what do we mean by consumption behavior of an individual is interdependent? So this simply means that the ratio of income consumed depends on the individual's absolute income as well as their relative. That is, consumption will depend on the permanent position in the total income distribution within the community. If increase in his or her income is accompanied by an improvement in his or her percentile position and vice versa. Simply means that your consumption will depend on your relative position in the community. So the income distribution in the community. So your position within the community in terms of the income distribution will determine your consumption. Now, if your position does not change over time, then your consumption pattern is not expected to change. Now, the other assumption, which means that the consumption relations are irreversible over time. Now, this assumption makes the relative income hypothesis to be referred to theory. Now, this means that when income falls, during the business cycles, now the resultant fall in consumption will be less than proportionate because individuals base their consumption patterns on the previous levels of income. When income increases, consumption increases proportionately. But when income falls below the previous peak, consumption does not increase proportionately. Now, this is a very important statement regarding the relative income hypothesis. Now, when your income increases, consumption increases proportionately. But when your income falls, consumption does not fall proportionately. So the level of fall in consumption will be less That is what it means that the consumption relations are irreversible over time. And you simply base your current level of consumption on the previous level of consumption. Now, if you look at that diagram, it simply describes that relationship well. So we have different levels of consumption. Now, the upward sloping curve that starts from the origin, this one simply shows that consumption is purely a function of what? Income. So we have different levels of consumption on the vertical axis. So we have C0, we have C1. So we have different levels of income. At the current level of income, which is Y0, so we have C0 is the corresponding level of consumption. So if income increases to Y1, then the corresponding level of consumption is C1. So we have, if the income increases now, we have C1, have Y1 there. That the level of income now falls from Y1 to Y0. What will happen to the level of consumption? So remember, we have the short-term consumption functions. We have C0 and C1. Those are the short-term consumption functions. Now, if the income falls from Y1 to Y0, the consumer will simply move backwards on the long-term or the long-term consumption function. So instead, the consumer will move back on the short run what? Consumption function. So you will not move backwards using the long run consumption function. So the level of consumption that corresponds to the Y1 is C1. So if the income falls, we expect the consumer to move back point A. So we expect the consumer from point B. That does not happen. Instead, the consumer will move back using the short run consumption function, which is C1. So you'll simply move back to point what? F. And therefore, you will consume at point F. So point F is above point A. So therefore, the consumer will consume at C prime prime. That's why we mean that when the income falls, consumption does not. In this case, the income has reduced from Y1 to Y0, but consumption has not reduced back to point A originally. But instead, the consumer has moved back using the short-run consumption function, which is C1. That is what that assumption means that consumption relations are irreversible over time. And if consumption, the level of income increases, then the consumption is expected. But if income falls below the previous peak, then consumption does not proportionately. Now, I said this is the long-term consumption function. We also have the short-term consumption functions C0 and C1. So the C0, C1 simply refers to the long-run, the short-run consumption functions. And this one is the long-run consumption functions. Now, from that diagram, I think it's clear that if income increases from Y0 to Y1, as I've explained earlier, the consumption moves along the long-run consumption function. So the consumption simply moves along the long-run consumption function. The consumer will simply consume at point B from point A. So the increase in income causes the short-run consumption function to shift. So there is a shift in the consumption, that is the short-run consumption function. But if there is a decrease in income, so that does not lead to a downward shift of the short-run consumption function. It does not lead to a downward consumption. And this simply that the consumer will simply move on the short-run consumption function. And this is what we refer to as the ratchet effect. So the ratchet effect simply makes the consumer to move backwards along the short-run consumption function following a decrease in what? In income. So when income falls back to Y note, the consumption expenditure moves consumption function C1 to point F from and P is clearly higher than point A. That is what we refer to as the ratchet effect. So if I take you back to the diagram, so you can see the diagram. So we said when the income increases, the consumer simply moves along the long run consumption function and consumes at point P. When the income falls to Y note, our expectation is that the consumer will again move backward. That effect, the consumer does not move back along the long run consumption function, but instead he moves back using the short run consumption function C1, and therefore he will spend at point F. The point F is higher than point A. Therefore, the consumption level that is associated is C prime prime. Third consumption is what we refer to as the permanent income hypothesis. So, as the permanent income hypothesis says, so this hypothesis was put forward by an economist referred to as Friedman in 1957. It states that consumption depends on the permanent income, and the permanent income is defined as the present value of the expected flow of long-term income. So you need to understand the term permanent income. It has been defined as the present value of expected flow of long-term income. Now, according to this hypothesis, the permanent consumption, the permanent income. So that simply means that level of income. So the ratio of consumption to the induced consumption is constant at all levels of income. So that simply means that the income consists of two components. So we have the permanent income, and we also have income. So we have the transitory income. So the transitory income refers to the unexpected or a fall in income, which is simply given by the difference between the measured income and permanent income. So that gives you the transitory income. Sorry, there was a disconnection error. I don't know what is the problem with the site, but I hope you can hear me now. There was a disconnection problem, but I'm back. So you continue from the permanent income hypothesis that I was talking about. So I said that the income consists of two components. So we have the permanent income component and the and consumption depends on the permanent income because the transitory income simply is an expected increase or fall in the income. Therefore, consumption does not depend on the transitory income, but it depends on the permanent income. So the transitory income can be positive or negative, or it can be zero. And that the sum of the transitory income for a group of parts is equal to zero. So that simply means that if we compute the transitory income for a community or for a society, it will be equal to zero. That is why this hypothesis emphasizes that consumption depends on the permanent income. Because the transitory income can be zero, it can be negative, or it can be positive, and it is a short-term increase or decrease. Now, like the measured income, so the measured consumption also has two parts. So the measured consumption has the permanent consumption part, which is the normal or a planned level of spending. So like you have a budget in a month, how much you need to spend, which is also a function of the permanent income. So the permanent consumption depends on the permanent income. And the transitory consumption also depends on the unplanned or temporary increase in the income. So that simply means that the consumption function is made up of two parts. So I've mentioned the permanent consumption part and the transitory part. Now, since, as I said earlier, that the sum of transitory, then transitory consumption is also zero. So in this case, we can rewrite the basic consumption function as a function of permanent income. If we rewrite our consumption function, we get this, that function is a function of permanent income. And in this case, K here is the marginal propensity to consume. Now, since we have said if the total sum of transitory income is zero, then the transitory consumption would also be zero. That means that our consumption, or the permanent consumption, will be a function of the permanent income. That is what that question means. Now, the last hypothesis or income hypothesis that we can discuss is the life cycle income hypothesis. So the life cycle income hypothesis is also, or it's sometimes referred to as the MPA hypothesis. So the MPA hypothesis simply means Modigliani, Framberg, and Ando. So it was formulated by Modigliani, Ando, and that's why it's called the life cycle income hypothesis. So what does the life cycle income hypothesis says? So this simply states that consumption is a function of the expected stream of disposable income over a long period of time and the present value of wealth. So it is a function of the expected income over a long period of time and the present value of wealth. Individuals are assumed to spread out their present value of all future income streams on consumption throughout their life. Therefore, consumption is assumed to be a function of lifetime income. So according to the life cycle income hypothesis, consumption is simply a function of lifetime income. And the lifetime income is the disposable income over a long period of time plus the present level of wealth. So if you look at that diagram, is the life cycle hypothesis. So we need to look at the diagram critically. Now, so we have three levels. Savings is less than zero. So if your savings is less than zero, then the individual is simply a net borrower. This part here. So the individual is simply borrowing, consume. And at that level, you can see where the consumption function is and where the income function is. So the consumption function is above the income function. So you can see curve, consumption curve. So at this level here, consumption is greater than the income. So which means that this guy is borrowing to consume. the second part is where the income is above the consumption curve. So if income is above the consumption curve, it simply means that the individual is a net saver. Here, savings is greater than zero. So if the savings is greater than zero, the individual has more income than the consumption expenditure. Again, here, the last part is where the income again is less than consumption. And the individual here is now a net saver. So the net saver simply means that the individual is now consuming from whatever is saved during this part here when income was more than consumption. So when the income is more than consumption, so the individual is savings here. So he's saving. The once now the income goes below the consumption part, so the individual consumes whatever he had saved. Now, you can take you are borrowing, maybe you rely on your parents or your guardians for support. Now you are a net borrower. Whatever you consume is what you borrow from your parents and your guardians. So once you complete your studies and you get employed, now your income is more than your level of consumption. So you pay part of the debts that you borrowed during the first stage, and also you save. And maybe after you have retired, now you have saved, and therefore you are now a net saver, simply consuming from whatever you had saved. Now, when the consumption is greater than income, so the individual is simply borrowing to consume and build up human capital. So when income is greater than consumption, the individual is paying loans and savings for future consumption. So you're also making an investment, and whatever you will give your sons and daughters. Then we have consumption is greater than income. So the individual is consuming out of savings, the pensions and the social security fund. So you are simply consuming whatever you saved. Now, according to the life cycle income hypothesis, so the average propensity to consume is higher in the early and late years of the individual's life. Now, this is why there is an unproportionality in income and the consumption relationship in the short run. Now, in the long run, are proportional. So that is what you can note from this diagram. I hope you can see this on the diagram well, and that is the life cycle. That is the last hypothesis that we can mention. We have discussed income as a major determinant of what? Consumption. But we also have other factors or determinants of consumption, so which we can also highlight here or discuss. Of interest, And according to the classical economy, individuals will save more and spend less as interest rates increases. So we discussed this, the relationship between savings and the interest rates. And we said that when the interest rate is high, the household will sacrifice consumption and save more in order to get high returns. So the interest rate failing in the economy will also determine the consumption behavior of households. So we have the relative prices. So the relative prices, this influences consumption behavior with consumers shifting relatively cheaper goods. So the relative prices, this simply depends on the prices of various goods, and of course when the prices of one good changes, so the consumer will simply shift to the cheaper substitute good. And therefore, that will also affect the consumption behavior. So we have capital gains. So the capital gains, those who invested in capital assets like the shares and properties that are characterized by capital gains. The windfall or gain or losses which influence consumption. If we assume that you had invested in the Nairobi Stock Exchange, and then within a short period of time, the prices of the shares that you invested in doubled. So if you redeem your shares now, you will have double what you had invested. And that is a capital gain. And this is your consumption. So whatever you get from such investment, you can go and consume somewhere. The other determinant is wealth. So if you can remember, we mentioned one of the hypotheses that wealth is the present value of wealth also influences consumption. So the high stock of wealth leads to low marginal value and hence less desire to accumulate more. As a result, this leads to increased consumption. So if you have high levels of wealth, so what normally happens is that you will not have that need to continue investing more, but instead you'll increase your consumption because the marginal value of wealth is very low. So you'll continue to more than to invest more, and that will determine your consumption behavior. So we have the money stock as another determinant, so the liquid assets. So the higher the stock of assets, the higher the marginal propensity to consume. So if you have or you have invested in liquid assets, so this one is likely to increase your consumption behavior because liquid assets, it's much easier to turn them into cash than if you had invested in capital assets. So it will be difficult or lengthy. It will take time for you to go and sell land and other capital assets to consume than if deals. So those one you can sell within a short period of time and consume. Availability of consumer credit, this will also affect the consumption behavior. So if you can borrow cheaply from the financial institutions for consumption, So this will, of course, push the aggregate consumption function upwards. So attitudes and expectations of consumers. So the consumer attitudes and expectations affect consumption behavior. So if you expect, for example, an increase in prices of certain goods, so you are likely to buy more presently to avoid paying higher prices in the future. That will affect your consumption behavior. There is also what we refer to as the money illusion. So you need to understand what we mean by money illusion. So the money illusion simply occurs when we fail to realize the price increase accompanying the increase in the, thereby behaving as though the real income has increased when it does not. So this can also be referred to as the real cash balance effect. So the real cash balance effect or the money illusion, what we mean. So we have levels of inflation in an economy. So for example, if you get a 10% increase in your income and the price level in the economy increases by 30% or 20%. So you are likely to suffer from the money illusion if you increase your consumption based on a 10% increase in your income that you have. But if you factor the price increase or the level of inflation in the economy, so you will realize that you have not received any increase in your money. And that is what we refer to as the money illusion. So people can suffer from the money illusion. So once your nominal income has increased, then you rush to increase your consumption expenditure, not realizing that the level of prices of goods and services have also gone up. We also have distribution of income that will also affect the consumption behavior. So the income redistribution will shift the aggregate consumption function and lead to a shift or the change in the slope of the function. So it therefore affects the level of aggregate consumption if the recipient have different propensity to consume and the average propensity to consume. So we also have the composition of the population will also determine the consumption behavior. So the composition of the population in terms of age, sex, class, influence the consumption behavior. Those are other factors that affect the consumption. Now, the other part that we need to analyze is investment demand theory. So we have looked at saving, we have looked at the investment, at consumption. So we need to finalize with investment demand theory. So investment simply refers to the addition of capital in the economy. So it is given by the value of the aggregate output for any given year that take the form of construction of shares. So we have changes in inventories, and we also have new capital investment. We have various types of investment that we can discuss. The first one is what we refer to as the autonomous investment. So the autonomous investment, this is the investment that doesn't depend on the level of income. So it is determined by as factors like the population growth, wealth changes, research, etc. So we have induced investment. So the one that depends on the level of income or profits. All the factors that affect profit or income also affects induced. So the induced investment function of income that we described by this equation. So investment here we have now the induced investment and the autonomous investment. The I note is the investment and the lambda Y is the induced investment. So that lambda simply represents the marginal propensity to invest. So the marginal propensity to invest is simply the change in investment due to a unit change in income. Propensity to invest is the ratio of so we have the gross investment and the net investment. So the gross investment is the total increase in the capital stock in a year. And the net investment is the net addition to capital stock and economy after deducting what we refer to as the capital consumption allowance or depreciation. We also have intended and unintended investment. So intended investment is referred to as the voluntary or planned investment. It refers to the deliberate accumulation of capital stock aimed at achieving a specific objective. So the unintended or involuntary or unplanned investment is the capital stock accumulated due to unexpected fall in demand. We also have private investment, which is the investment made by private investors in the economy. And we all have the public investment, which is the investment made by the government and other public enterprises. So we can look at the determinants of investment. What determines the level of investment in an economy? So the first determinant is the interest rate. So investment is inversely related to the interest rate, which means that as the interest rate increases, the level of investment will fall. And if interest rates falls, then the level of investment is expected to rise. we also as a determinant of investment. So this is the rate of return that equates the present value of benefits from present investment to the present value of its costs. Now, investors normally compare this internal rate of return with the interest rate. So if the internal rate of return is greater than the interest rate, then investment is made. Then they don't invest. Okay, so we can continue. There is some disruption from one of you. You can unmute your mic. Sorry, mute your mic because I can see some distractions from somewhere. So the other factor that we can discuss is the expected future flows that can also affect or determine the level of investment. So if the investment, sorry, they affect high profits, the investment is likely to increase and vice versa. So the initial cost of capital of the capital good and its useful lifetime can also determine the level of investment. So if capital good is affordable, then it will be purchased and we expect more investment and vice versa. The degree of certainty in the economy. So the investor considers the level of uncertainties in economy. If uncertainty is high, then that investor may not invest. Stock of capital. So if the existing capital is low, the potential investors may be discouraged. So if there is excess or idle capacity, the existing stock, so the investors will not be encouraged to invest more, because if they are not utilizing the available capacity, then why should they invest? We have the level of income. So we said that if the level of income is high in the economy, so people are likely to save more and they are likely to save to invest more, simply because there will be high demand for goods and services. So the level of income simply determines the aggregate demand. So if the aggregate demand is high, then people will invest more, will increase the level of investment. We have business expectations as also another factor that determine investment. So the business expectations. So if the businessmen expect high return future, consumer demand If the consumer demand is increasing rapidly, because firms will be encouraged to invest more. So liquid assets. So if the investor has large liquid assets, is likely to invest more. So we have invention and innovation as a determinant of investment also. So the energy improvements lead to more efficient methods of production. So this will reduce costs, that the marginal efficiency of the new capital assets will rise. Therefore, the firms will be encouraged to invest more. We have new products. New products. So if there are new products in the economy, firms will also be encouraged to invest more in the new products, increase their revenue. Population grows, another population grows. That simply means that there is a large market for goods and services. And this will encourage firms to invest more to serve the expanded market. Have the government policy as a determinant of investment. The government can take various measures to encourage investment, like reducing taxes, provision of social amenities, etc. So that will encourage investment. And finally, the political climate and stability, that will also encourage investment. Where we have political stability, so the environment will be conducive for investment. But where we have political instability, investors get discouraged because of uncertainties. Therefore, they may not invest. Those are the factors that determine investment in the economy. Now the floor is open for your questions.